Okay, Ling 441, we're back. After having talked at length about the motor theory of speech perception, I thought it would be fitting to get into a discussion of the musculature of the vocal tract, or maybe at least a description of the musculature of the vocal tract, so we know a little bit more about how we actually articulate things when we speak, or the mechanics of how we use our articulators, I guess you could say. But Right. So I lost my train of thought there for a second. But before we get into that, yeah, so I guess what I was going to say is that normally I kind of combine this with the palatography demos. So I'll probably post the palatography demo that I do wherever, at home probably, along with this video so you can watch it and get a sense of how to do that. And again, you're welcome to try that at home if you feel so motivated. Before I get into this particular lecture, I wanted to go back to something I touched on briefly in the motor theory lecture, which was the notion of Brocas area and what can happen if your Brocas area is damaged for whatever reason. So I actually have these old videos kind of from the same era and time from when they were discovering the McGurk effect. So these are of a couple of patients. I don't remember exactly where I got these. This is actually, if you can believe it, before YouTube existed. So about 15 years ago. These are a couple of patients in, I think Madison, Wisconsin is where they're from, at least in the healthcare system there. So you get to hear some nice upper Midwest accents in here. But there's going to be one I'm going to show you of Brocas area. So this is when you get damage this is Brocas Aphasia. It's when you damage your Brocas area and you lose a lot of the ability to articulate things just in general. The second one will be an example of a patient with Werners Aphasia. And I'll talk a little bit more about that one after we watch this first video. Yeah, so we won't go through the whole thing, but at least a little bit of it.
Now tell me what this thing was with your legs last week or week before.
No good. Ache and knees and ankles.
What'd you do about it?
Home, doctor, and legs.
Yeah, so I think you kind of get the idea. It's just not easy to say anything when you have that condition. And who knows exactly, I don't know exactly how this guy acquired it. A likely candidate is that he had a stroke of some sort that damaged that part of his brain. I know I have had former students in this class in our program who are interested in going into speech therapy, and some of them have worked as speech therapy assistants, sort of working on therapy for patients with this condition. In the past, I don't know if this is as prevalent, but you can get this through just a brain injury, sort of physical trauma as well. In the early days of my tenure here at the University of Calgary, I had some students helping patients who had acquired Brocas Aphasia through military action, coming back from Afghanistan or what have you. So that sort of thing can happen as well. I don't know as much about this as I should, unfortunately, but my understanding is that this can be alleviated through therapy, through sort of discussions like this or practice talking more. But that is kind of the main point is that there is a part of your brain which is specifically devoted to organizing articulations. And when you lose that part of your brain or the functionality of it, then you lose that ability to speak as well. And your brain kind of has to work around it to get better. I will show you the Wernicke's patient as well. Some intro psycholinguistics texts talk about Brocas aphasia as like a productive aphasia, and Wernicke's aphasia is like a receptive aphasia. So Wernicke's is when you damage the part of your brain that's closer to the auditory cortex, or the portion of your brain that's devoted to processing auditory signals. So there might be more of a link there. But as you'll see in this video, this patient has issues with production as well. It's just of a totally different sort than what we saw in the previous video.
They're foot, boom.
What's this?
The big end right there. End of the football.
End of the football?
It influenced the football right here. The cause that it comes in, see?
Yeah.
The end of it, see? Yeah. Oh, we have all of these, see?
I don't understand.
Well, it's pliable in the other, see? You don't understand it, but it plies in the long thread reed comes from there, and it comes soars from the country out through it, see? All the under it, see, it comes up, and finally come out here and goes out, see? Get it?
Sort of.
Yeah, it comes out here, see? It comes out here, and here, and it comes in, and it comes out, and bing. That's a good fly throw, see?
Yeah. So who knows, right? He's got something in mind, but it's not sort of easily understandable. Long time ago, another Calgary story I can give you is that way back in the olden days, I went on some date with a girl down in sort of the Kensington area. We were just walking around, and one of her neighbors came up to us and started talking in a very similar fashion to what that second patient, the way he was speaking. And it was, if you're not used to that, it's not, a comfortable sort of conversation to have with somebody. And having watched that video a number of times, I kind of figured out that he probably had that condition. But the girl I was with was not super delighted with that part of the date, I guess you could say. And rationalizing it with linguistics knowledge didn't really help. So lucky for me, that was another romantic relationship that went nowhere. So it's good to be out of that scene, but you guys enjoy it while you're still there. Anyways, let's talk about how we actually articulate things in speech. So I'm going to talk about this with respect to the 4 primary active articulators that we have that we can move around, calling this the toolkit. So the 4 that we can play around with are, number 1, the lips, number 2, the lower jaw, or what is technically known as the mandible. You can also obviously move around the tongue, and then fourthly, the velum. And we already have a sense of how these factor into the various places of articulation and the various basic properties of speech sounds and what have you. I will also let you know that the 5th one is the pharynx, which can be constricted to some extent. There are kind of sphincter muscles around your pharynx, which can make it constrict like this. I'm not going to talk about that a whole lot because that doesn't get involved with a whole lot of the speech sounds that we're used to thinking about. But just so you know, you can play around with that one as well. So separate sets of muscles control each one of these articulators. I'm going to walk through them in order like this. The tongue is the most complicated one by far. The velum is, we go up in complexity through the tongue, and then the velum is not quite as complicated as that. But let's start out with the lips and what we can do with those. Oh, right, yes, I have this little slide about articulatory speed. This is also kind of related to phonology as well. So the fastest articulator is the tongue tip, which can move can exhibit, 7 to 9.5 movements per second if you really get it going. And that, I believe, is as a result of muscular action rather than just sort of the trilling you get in, say, like an alveolar trill. The reason that the tongue tip can be moved so quickly is because it's a relatively small or not massive articulator that you can sort of exhibit a lot of force on really quickly. There are other articulators generally speaking, are a little bit more massive, like say the mandible. Your whole jaw doesn't move around that quickly, so that you can max out at 6 to 8.5 movements per second. The back of the tongue is more massive than the front of the tongue, so that's about 5.5 to 9 movements per second. The velum, again, massive. The back of your palate, that's about 5 to 7.8 movements per second, and the lips are in the middle there as well. So these are all kind of in the same general vicinity of how fast you can move them. Maybe the mandible and the back of the tongue a little bit more quickly on the high end. But you can kind of think about this. Oftentimes phonologists cite coronals as kind of the default or unmarked place of articulation in language. And it's possible there's an articulatory sort of foundation for that, such that the tongue tip, which you can move around really quickly and easily, is kind of the easiest place of articulation for you to produce a sound with. So take that for what it's worth, and we'll move on, like I said, to the lips. And I'll point out before we get into that I'm going to give you some of the specific muscles which can move the lips around, but with basically any articulation in speech, we're not just moving one articulator around, we're coordinating motions of multiple articulators at the same time. So generally speaking with the lips, say if you want to make a labial closure, you'll not only constrict the muscles for the lips, but you will get the mandible moving around in conjunction with that. You might have to raise up your whole jaw to get the lips closer to each other, and you will do that if it makes it a little bit more convenient or efficient to do so. So for this reason, the lips can be raised and lowered faster because you're combining motions with the mandible. Then they can be protruded and rounded, which is more of a sort of lip-independent kind of gesture. Okay, so what muscles do we use to do this? There is a muscle, it's also like a sphincter muscle, you could say, which goes around your lips. It's called the orbicularis oris muscle. And that, when you contract it, is going to basically round your lips. So it will also compress them to a certain extent, which means pushing them together like that, as well as rounding them in that fashion. There's also a muscle which is not depicted here called the mentalis, which is more on the top and bottom, which protrudes the lips like that. And the contraction of what's called the risorius muscle or contraction of the risorius muscle will retract and the corners of the lips and spread them as well. So, like I said, it's nice to link these up with language, and basically the orbicularis oris is what you contract to produce lip-rounded vowels like ooh. The risorius, though, is something you can kick in to create vowels that have lip spreading. We don't talk about active lip spreading that much in phonetics, but you get it, say, in a vowel like E, right? E, or anytime you smile, basically. So the reason, maybe a reason why we say cheese when we are trying to have our photographs taken is because the E will spread our lips and reveal our teeth and make it look more like we're actually smiling rather than just kind of grinning and bearing it when we have our picture taken, right? So that's how you get that effect. Something I will mention along the way, though, is that this has a particular acoustic effect. And normally I ask this question in class. So if I'm saying a vowel like E, if I'm spreading my lips, what acoustic effect do you think that would have on vowel formants? We've talked at some length or at various times about the acoustic effect of lip rounding. Kind of spun that initially as like a form of lengthening your vocal tract, ooh, and lengthening the vocal tract would lower the vowel formants, right? And we talked about it in terms of perturbation theory as making a constriction where there is a velocity antinode, ooh, which will also lower the vowel formants all the way down the line because there's velocity antinodes for each one of them at the lips, right? You can kind of think about lip spreading E in the opposite way. E, to a certain extent, if you're shortening your vocal tract by spreading your lips and bringing them a little bit closer to your glottis, you would expect that to raise the formants, right? You're making the whole vocal tract a little bit shorter, and that will give you higher resonant frequencies. So I can play two tokens here for you of me saying the same thing. One with my lips spread or as I'm smiling, and the other with me not smiling. So you maybe can figure out which one is which.
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about.
So if you are able to hear that closely, you might be able to tell that I'm smiling or something like it for this one.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so this is something that you've probably noticed in talking on the phone with somebody. You can tell when they're smiling, generally speaking, because smiling has this consistent acoustic effect on vowel formant frequencies. So we can take a look here. These are relatively old files, so they're not the greatest recordings.
I don't know what you're talking about.
But they're good enough.
I don't know what you're talking about.
So let's take a look at this. This is a nice, clear set of formants here for the ah and talking.
Bok, bok.
Right about here. 706.9 hertz for F1. About 1170 hertz for F2 for that ah.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And here I'm smiling or raising my lips. It's not working, so it's about the same for F1. And for F2, it's about 1273. So it's having maybe a little bit more of an effect on the F2 than it is on the F1. But that's what you should expect to get.
I don't know what you're talking about.
This is an interesting phenomenon. There's actually a theory that's been posited by a famous phonologist named John O'Hala, who thought that smiling is basically the result of sound symbolism due to lip spreading. So if you spread your lips, it makes your vocal tract maybe a little bit shorter and raises your formant frequency. So you are perceived basically as a smaller being, a smaller person, because you're raising your formant frequencies. So you kind of get that effect if you just smile like that. Well, maybe not like that. But if you smile, it makes you seem smaller, as it were, because that's associated, I guess, with higher formant frequencies. So if you're smaller, you're less threatening and possibly more friendly, and maybe that's why a smile is linked up with our concept of friendliness as human beings, which is kind of funny because if you think about it, like, they say don't smile at a wild animal or a dog or what have you, because that dog or wild animal will think that you're baring your teeth to show how aggressive you are because you have teeth that can hurt and maim them or whatever. We don't have great teeth for, injuring dogs or bears or what have you. So maybe they're better used as objects of kindness, I guess. So better living through linguistics as usual. All right. Articulator number 2, the jaw, is a big one. So you have to use multiple muscles usually to move it up and down because it's basically the most massive articulator we have. I'm going to walk through these. I have this diagram which shows you all the various muscles here. I'm going to kind of highlight some of them so you don't have to worry about quite all of these. The primary muscles that raise the jaw, the first one I'll talk about is the masseter. So this is right here, so it's vertical, and if you contract it, you can imagine that's going to make that distance shorter, so it's going to kind of raise this whole structure up from wherever it's sitting. Masseter, there's a funny word in English called, it's mastication, which is just like the fancy Latinate version of the word to chew. So you can think of masseter like mastication, and it is something that enables you to chew, right? Again, like all of our speech functions are overlaid on underlying biological functions like eating, and that's part of what these muscles are built to do, is enable us to eat, which is kind of fundamentally more important than language, at least historically for human beings, right? The temporalis just means on the side, so that one's over here. And again, every single one of these, when you contract them, it's going to raise this entire jaw structure up and kind of around this pivot a little bit higher towards your skull. The internal pterygoid is this one right in here. So again, this one's going to move the jaw a little bit forward because you contract in the horizontal dimension a little bit. And I've got little red arrows to point out these three in case you didn't see them well enough with the mouse before. Okay, so those are 3 primary raisers. The lowers that I want you to kind of focus on are, number 1, the anterior belly digastricus. which is right here. So most of these are kind of linking up to the bottom of your jaw, this point at the front of it, and then somewhere back here. You can see there's a whole bunch of them. So you can track those, and it's going to basically lower the jaw and also move it backwards a little bit. When we go to see the corpses at the lab at the hospital, at the teaching lab, for the so-called larynx field trip, Dr. Bertram usually goes on a short discursus about this muscle. It's got this name belly in it, and if I remember correctly, I've heard this multiple times, but not for a couple of years, but it's this interesting feature that when you are in utero, when you're first developing sort of your body shape as a fetus, you're kind of curled over with your body kind of folded in half almost. And this muscle kind of develops first at your belly, and then it kind of like unfolds with you, which is why you get this kind of connection underneath the jaw down to the lower part of your neck. Yeah, you should go actually to that field trip whenever we get the chance again, so you get the real story with that, and not my sort of Cliff's Notes version, because he tells it better and actually knows what he's talking about. But again, looking at diagrams like this is sort of no substitute for the real thing. It may help you understand it better, but when you see the real thing, you see just how complicated the human body really is, and it's amazing. The geniohyoid muscle is here. So this point that I was referring to before is referred to as the gene, and so that muscle connects the hyoid to the gene, and again, if you contract that, you'll get the same sort of lowering and backing motion of the jaw. Then also the mylohyoid, which is in here, still attached to the hyoid on this end and to another structure, I guess, known as the mylo or something in the front there. But the main point is that if you want to lower the jaw, you have to get all these muscles kind of working in concert to do it. So I've got red arrows for that, and also the underscoring the point that when you lower your jaw, it also retracts a little bit. That's why you have the kind of joint up here to give it a chance to pivot a little bit. Okay, people, it turns out, can produce vowels perfectly fine even when their jaws are open. So you can, or normally do, get your jaws involved in the production of vowels or many different speech articulations, but you don't have to, at least according to Lindblom, 1979. And this is kind of a funny series of studies from back in the good old days of articulatory phonetics. So the way he designed this, this is Bjorn Lindblom, another famous phonetician, is that he had people biting on what's called a bite block. So these you may have encountered it when you go to the dentist, where you just bite on something to sort of keep your mouth open so the dentist can kind of poke around in there. And again, this is sort of adapting something with a more basic function to the analysis of speech in phonetics, but he had people bite on one of these bite blocks and just say, well, can you say E or ah or some vowel? And found out that people could do it. So in particular, adults would get the formants right off the bat. They didn't need to really adjust, but kids needed a little bit of time to learn how to sort of speak in the right way with that sort of whatever speed bump in their way, I guess you could say. But yeah, it's kind of amazing. So it's one thing to think about, like maybe our minds are good enough at sort of calculating which formants to produce that we can kind of do it on the fly once we get really good at producing speech. There was a different study a few years later by this group, Abs et al., that didn't have people sort of biting on a bite block and being in a static position when they produce these vowels, but instead they have what they call the strain gauge, and this is the part that gets funny to me. You might as well also find it amusing. So they were able to put a device on the point of a person's jaw here that I mentioned before, and when they were trying to say sequences like ah, ba, which involves ah, ba, lifting your jaw up and down, when they were sort of supposed to get the timing of pushing the jaw up for the ba, they would push it down with this device. So ah, ba, I can't really do it with my finger, which is why they had to use something mechanical. All of a sudden my jaw is no longer helping out my lips to make that closure. And what happens, believe it or not, when you do that is, well, maybe the phoneticians have a good laugh, but they also learn something about how we organize speech articulations, which is that your lips, if they need to, can operate independently and get to that articulatory target without the help of the jaw, even on the fly. So the way this diagram works is it's showing time here on the x-axis, and then it's looking at sort of the activation of different muscles that we use to move the lips around. So we've got the orbicularis oris, and we've got the mentalis, so on and so forth. And it's got kind of this basic line up here at the top of the white shaded area, which shows you how much activity you get in the lips in sort of the normal case where you're not pushing the person's jaw down as they're saying this, but then the dark shaded case is what you get when you do push the jaw down. And so the lips are basically adjusting on the fly to hit that target of closure with themselves, whereas they would normally do this if they were being helped by the jaw, but without the jaw's help, they just kind of make do. So what's also interesting about this is the lip muscles adjust immediately for the sudden jaw lowering, and that adjustment happens faster than the electrical signals can travel from your lips to the motor cortex in your brain and back. So this dashed line I didn't tell you about is called the load onset. That's when they're starting to push your jaw, and the reaction from the lips, this being 200 milliseconds, this happens within just a few milliseconds. So it's kind of amazing. It's almost as if your lips had a mind of their own. That might be one way to think about it, but another way to think about it is that your brain just kind of plans to go until like it hits the target. And then when it feels it doesn't have to do it, push things in that direction anymore, right? So that's kind of fun. Number 3, our third articulator, as I said, is the most complex one. So this is the tongue. The muscles controlling the tongue come in 2 groups. One set is called the intrinsic muscles, which are just within the tongue by itself. And the other set is called the extrinsic muscles, which connect the tongue to outside structures. So we've kind of seen some extrinsic muscles when looking at like the jaw, like those connections between like the point of your jaw and the hyoid, so on and so forth. In this case, you're looking at connections for the extrinsic muscles from the tongue and other structures like the hyoid and so on and so forth. It's a little bit easier to understand the intrinsic muscles because the tongue itself is just one big muscle, or one big set of muscles, I guess you could say. So there are 4 of these that I want you to know about. The first 2 are called longitudinal muscles. So we're borrowing some of the language of anatomy here, which again is largely derived from Latin. So longitudinal just means that these muscles run lengthwise down the length of the tongue. And superior just means that it's on the top of the tongue, and inferior means it's on the bottom of the tongue. The transverse muscles run crosswise through the tongue, and the vertical muscles are within the tongue itself, and they contract and kind of flatten the whole thing out. Okay, so what do these look like in diagram form? The superior longitudinal muscle is up here on the top, and like I said, it runs lengthwise here. So that one's easy to imagine because you're all, to the extent that you think about your tongue, you probably think about, stuff that's on top of it. This, when we're speaking, is instrumental in producing alveolars and retroflexes. So as you can imagine, if you're contracting this length, that would raise the tongue up and potentially back into like a retroflex position. So you can kind of think about this as like the coronal muscle. Normally I'll scribble these facts down as we're walking through these because we just kind of have a lot of facts to learn in this lecture. So I'd recommend that if you're getting swamped by all the details, that you can kind of pause this and scribble these things out yourself. It'll probably help you learn or at least remember all of the various terminological details. On the other side of this, we have the inferior longitudinal muscle, which is down on the bottom. So if you contract this, it kind of makes this length shorter. And the idea here is that it pulls the tongue tip down and back, which would kind of put you in a better position for making tongue blade articulations. So if you can keep the tongue tip down, that enables you to kind of play around with this bit of the tongue and pushing it against the teeth or maybe against the alveolar ridge as well. But basically any sort of tongue blade or laminal articulations would use the inferior longitudinal muscle to get themselves in the right position. Okay, so that's there. The sort of coronal or side-to-side view of the tongue shows us the transverse muscles, which are, like I said, laid out crosswise in the tongue, and that's where they get their name from. So if you contract these, it's going to pull the edges of the tongue into the middle, and will also kind of lengthen the tongue to some extent. So this is what you'd expect the speaker to use when they're trying to produce lateral sounds, like ol. In English, you squeeze your tongue into the middle, as we've seen before in multiple slides in previous lectures. I have a thesis about this. I don't even know why I'm going to throw this out now, but I'm sitting here all alone, so why not talk about it? But there are some interesting connections between dentals and velarization in not only English, but in other languages throughout the world. Darren Flynn can tell you more about those. But the issue here with sort of the combination of pulling the edges of the tongue into the middle and then lengthening the tongue at the same time is that the tongue is just, like I said, one set of muscles all kind of wrapped together. So if you contract in one dimension, something else has to expand because it's a constant mass, basically. So if you're contracting into the middle, that kind of makes the whole thing longer and will kind of give you extensions in both sort of the forward or dental direction as well as sort of the back or velar direction. So I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but there are some people out there in the world who, when they say the word both, will sometimes say both, and kind of in conjunction with that interdental fricative will give you a velarized L at the same time. Both. I don't do that so it doesn't come natively to me, but both. Yeah, so that might be one reason why, because otherwise that O in that context of a interdental fricative might have a tendency to move forward and be both or something like that, because those high back vowels like to move forward if they can next to coronal articulations. But maybe the muscles aren't like helping them do that in that particular case. This also shows you, generally speaking, what the vertical muscles in the tongue look like. So again, these are laid out top to bottom in the tongue, and if you contract these, it will flatten out the tongue, and that'll help you get that interdental articulation as well with a flat tongue. Okay, I'm not going to go into that whole thing. Talk to your genetics professor about that. Okay, but let's go into the extrinsic muscles. So we have the genioglossus is extrinsic muscle number 1, and kind of conveniently for us, these kind of all line up with the corner vowels in the vowel space. So the genioglossus, like I said, this is the gene and this is the glossus. That's the fancy Latin term for the tongue. So the genioglossus muscle is what connects those two structures together. And if you contract this, it's kind of like lined up in the same way as the inferior longitudinal muscle, but attached to something outside. So what happens with this kind of depends on which section of the tongue you're actually contracting here. If you contract the posterior part of this, or sort of the part that's closer to the back of your body, it will kind of lift the whole tongue structure up here towards the palatal place of articulation, which is useful when you're producing a vowel like E, which again is a high front vowel in the palatal sort of place of articulation, if it were a consonant, that is. If you contract the anterior genioglossus, which is further towards the front of your body, you get the same sort of effect that we saw with the contraction of the inferior longitudinal muscle, which is that it's going to pull the tongue tip down and a little bit back, which you might get for, say, a post-alveolar articulation when you're making a sh, and you want to kind of curl your tongue up a little bit to get that fricative in the right place in your vocal tract. But generally speaking, this is going to give you more, say, coronal type articulations towards the front of your mouth or using the front part of your tongue. If you have a hard time remembering this term, I don't know why you would, but just to burn it in your memory in horrifying fashion, I will let you know that Gene Simmons of the band Kiss is famous for using his tongue in this kind of explicit fashion. So the story with him is he supposedly cut that little bit of flesh that kind of connects the tongue to the bottom of your mouth so that he could stick his tongue out more. But to get the tongue in this position anyway, he'd have to use the genioglossus muscle. It's not named after him, but it might as well be. So yeah, maybe that will help you remember it. Otherwise, let's move on, shall we? Extrinsic muscle number 2 is the styloglossus. So this is going to connect to basically the back of the tongue and what's called the styloid process in front of the ear, so closer to back there. And if you contract that, it's going to shorten that distance, right? So it's going to kind of lift the tongue up and back into the velar place of articulation here. So that will give you not only velar stops and nasals and so on and so forth, but it can help you produce a vowel like oo. This diagram shows oo as being produced not only with the styloglossus muscle, but of course with the lip rounding, which you get from the orbicularis oris at the front of your mouth. It's possible this may also help groove or sulcalize the tongue, so making it more like that because you're pulling it up sort of to the sides. And we've seen way back in 341 that you can or often sulcalize the tongue when you're producing an articulation like S to kind of like guide the flow of air through your vocal tract and point it up straight towards the teeth to give you that strong sibilant effect of an S. Okay, so that you might rely on to help remember you that it's the styloglossus as opposed to the Hyoglossus or what we had before, the genioglossus. So the Hyoglossus is the third one. So this one gives us the third sort of vowel in the corner vowels of the vowel space. So the Hyoglossus connects the tongue to the hyoid bone, which is down here. Almost got through this whole lecture without messing that up, but I did. Anyways, if you contract this connection, it's going to lower the tongue. It's going to make this distance shorter. It's going to lower the tongue and kind of move it a little bit further back into your pharynx. They've also got the anterior belly digastricus muscle plotted out here. That's where that one is located. But that helps you lower your jaw. So if you do both of those things together, you can kind of get the ah, or the tongue into the right position for an ah, a nice low back pharyngeal vowel. This can also apparently pull the sides of the tongue down. So in case you want to do the opposite action of grooving the tongue, and this may be useful for like a sh type articulation, you could possibly get the hyoglossus muscles working for you on either sides. Okay, the last one I'll talk about in terms of extrinsic muscles is not really linked up with a corner vowel. Instead, this is the palatoglossus, and this connects the tongue to the soft palate. And this is, to be honest with you, when we have gone to the larynx field trip and taken a look at the various articulators in real life, this is the only extrinsic muscle I've been able to kind of see clearly there. It's pretty complex inside a human body, as I mentioned before. But this one's nice because it connects the tongue to the soft palate. So this is interesting because it can be used, it's basically going to shorten this distance here. So you can either use that to sort of raise the tongue up towards the velum, or you could use it to kind of pull the velum down if you wanted to, and get two kind of different phonetic effects on the basis of that one muscle. If you do lower the back of the tongue because it has this mechanical connection with the velum, you could possibly pull down the velum and lead to sort of a passive nasalization of low vowels. So if you're trying to get the tongue down here for like an ah, and you want to get the whole structure in a low pharyngeal position, it could lead to the velum itself coming down and you get sort of an ah type effect rather than ah. So why am I mentioning this? This connection has been cited as a possible reason for why we have what's called the Great Lakes vowel shift in modern English in the Great Lakes area of the northern United States. So I talked about this a little bit in 341. It's kind of a fun phenomenon, so I might as well talk about it again. The Great Lakes shift is a chain shift, which is a term you might have learned in historical linguistics, because first one vowel moves and then a series of others follow. And the idea, again, is that this is a shift with a phonetic basis. So what they think happened was that low vowels like a moved to be, well, they caused nasalization, basically, passive nasalization, like a went to and sounds maybe a little bit more like or maybe like and so this vowel over time, when enough people sort of got on board with this shift, sounded more like or a in the Great Lakes dialect region. And then the chain shifting part of this is that when a moved to then there was nothing left in that low front corner of the space, so moved to something more like or to be more like script A or this ash symbol. Then there was nothing left in the low back corner of the space, so o went to Then there was nothing left where o used to be, so went to o. And then there was nothing left where wedge used to be, so went to wedge. And the whole thing basically moved around in a circle because, remember, was what moved to in the first place, and now is moving away to sort of maintain space in that sort of adaptive dispersion kind of sense. Isn't that fun? So again, the theory is that vowels are supposed to stay distinct from one another so that people can understand what's being said. That's what Bjorn Lindblom said in the adaptive dispersion theory. But that has to be counterbalanced against these weird sort of articulatory effects where might all of a sudden not sound like anymore if you're starting to nasalize it. So this is a diagram I borrowed from Wikipedia a long time ago. I don't know how currently relevant it is, but it's probably pretty close. I used to live in the Chicago area when I was in high school back in the early 90s, and I definitely noticed this in the sort of variety of English that was spoken there. I've got a clip here. So this just says the Great Lakes shift was first noticed in the 60s, supposedly amongst the white working class in cities like Chicago or Milwaukee, so on and so forth. When I lived there, it was pretty widespread. This diagram also shows how various parts of the shift have spread throughout the northern United States. So the brown areas are giving you the odd a shift. The red line is showing you the ad and then the blue line is giving you the ed which is kind of the most progressed form of it because it's the last in the chain. Enough talk. I'll just let you listen to this. This is a recording of a Chicago policeman from the show This American Life.
I know. I come here all the time. I used to know 2971 Lincoln. Mike is always hanging around, and there's, Bob over there. He's sitting on the end. Hey, Bob, how you doing? Donna, Mary, Dave, the one cab driver. I've come here quite a bit.
Yeah, so Bob or Donna. That's kind of a classic Chicago sound. It takes me right back to high school, for better or for worse. So I've got a couple other samples here. I play this one in 341. This is also the odd a shift.
Bob.
A little more subtle, perhaps, but Bob. And this is another clip I just randomly found. It was a news story from Wisconsin again, where again, also from a cop, but he had been called into like a restaurant like Denny's or whatever, where they have one of those like claw machines where you can kind of pick out a stuffed animal if you pay them money that you're never going to see again. And somehow a little kid had been able to crawl inside the like stuffed animal zone and was like having the time of his life in there.
We actually tried to get his attention a few times because he was playing. So, he was happy to be in there, but I don't think Mom and Dad were too happy. Yeah,
so happy. That's what you can expect if you ever go to Wisconsin, I guess. Like I said, this is pretty widespread. In Minnesota, too, where I grew up, it wasn't really there when I was growing up, though, which is kind of funny. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, not Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is its own dialect region. It does something different. And also not so much across the border in Canada. So you don't really hear this in Toronto or Hamilton or so on and so forth. I did once meet somebody from Windsor who exhibited this, so maybe it's crossed over there a little bit. I know there's a lot of cultural influence over in this part of Ontario where they sort of look to Detroit or Michigan for whatever reason as like a cultural lodestar. But that is another interesting phenomenon of how Canadian English and American English are sort of going in their separate ways because Canadian English has a shift too, which is in the opposite direction. So this is the Great Lakes shift. And like I said, everything kind of has to move around in a circle to make sure that all the vowels are still distinct from one another, but it's like linguistic musical chairs where they're just like sitting in a different spot now than where they were before. All of these shifts for the Great Lakes shift were in this kind of clockwise direction in the vowel space. I talk about the Canadian shift, though, in 341. I'll just briefly revisit it here. So the vowels of Canadian English have shifted in the opposite direction of the Great Lakes shift because, I don't know, maybe Canadians don't want to be confused with somebody from Wisconsin. But this is what it sounds like. So the way I would pronounce it.
6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob.
So that's Bob rather than Bab. And this is another Canadian speaker who has it as more of like an O, open O, but a little higher, a little more rounded.
6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob.
Yeah, there's possibly some English influence there as well. So this is me.
I usually smoke about half a pack a day.
That's me jumping the gun with that first example. So half a pack a day.
I usually smoke about half a pack a day.
Haven't lost that element of my Americanness yet, but this is how a more Canadian variant of that same sentence would sound.
I usually smoke about half a pack a day.
So half a pack a day. So a little bit lower.
6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob.
A little bit lower, a little bit more centralized. I seem to have lost control of my mouse. Nope, got it. Okay. So this is me again.
I usually smoke about half a pack a day.
Half a pack a day.
I usually smoke about half a pack a day.
Yeah, so that's subtle. When you come from where I come from and you're a phonetician, you pick it up pretty quickly. But I think you can hear it if you start listening for it. There are also newer shifts that people have documented underway in Canadian English. So I'll give you some samples from the TA I had for this class. First time I taught it in Canada, who's about my age and didn't exhibit this shift a whole lot. I've heard it a lot more in younger female speakers, particularly in my classes. So here's how to say this word the old way.
Bed.
Or something with this vowel in it. Then there's this vowel.
Bid.
And then there is this vowel.
Hood.
Right. So I, the has actually shifted more towards that
Head.
rather than
Bed.
and then this I has shifted more towards
Head.
rather than
Bid.
and it's subtle. It's not quite all the way there. And then lastly, I've noticed this really hasn't been documented in the literature. I should work on that. But this vowel
Hood.
is moving to a more central position.
Hood.
Like that speaker produces it. So if you chart these all out, all of these various Canadian shifts are moving in a counterclockwise direction. I didn't mention this one, but this is the fronting of oo.
Spoon.
Spoons.
Like that. Here's our fronted
Hood. Hood.
which might actually be all the way to here by this point. Is lowering.
Bid. Head.
And as lowering.
Bed. Head.
As lowering.
Half.
And then is getting backer and more rounded.
Bob.
Or at least more rounded. Every single one of these shifts is moving in a counterclockwise direction in the opposite of the American shift, which is kind of fun. But still, we can understand each other to at least some extent, right? It's not that bad. Okay, lastly, I'll tell you about the velar muscles, just for good measure. So this is the last articulator we can play around with, the soft palate at the back of the top of our mouths. So the muscle which raises the velum is called the Levator Palatini. That connects the velum to the temporal bone. So here in your skull, if you contract that, it's going to pull that whole structure up. For some reason, lots of students like to laugh at this one, Levator Palatini, and they think it's like a spell from Harry Potter or something like that. So if that helps you remember it, then go right ahead. I don't know what Harry Potter would have to do with orally produced sounds, but there you have it. And the velum is lowered by both the Palatoglossus, the connection between the palate and the tongue, and the palatopharyngeus, which is a longer muscle which goes between the pharynx down here and the palate here. So you can see, hopefully, if you contract that, it's going to lower the velum as well and allow air to flow through your nose. So you can produce nasal sounds like Okay. I'm going to skip the palatography slides there at the tail end and just say that's it for our tour of the muscles of the vocal tract. Next time we'll talk about audition or hearing to kind of get the counterpart of what we do when we talk. And that's a lot of fun too. So I'll be looking forward to that when I record the next lecture tomorrow or whenever you happen to listen to it. Okay, see you then.